Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege to welcome you all to this morning's masterclass. My name's Jane Sharwood, for those of you who I've not yet met, and I'm the Manager of Business and International at the City of Melbourne. I respectfully acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. As you are no doubt aware, Melbourne is one of the world's most multicultural and diverse cities. We are home to people from over 200 countries, speaking over 230 languages and dialects, and practising over 120 religious faiths. There's good material for film and documentary. Close to half of all the residents within the City of Melbourne were born overseas. This diversity has greatly influenced our cultural identity. And within this mix, we find Melbourne's rapidly growing Indian community. Of course, we've had a long-standing Indian community, which has in more recent years been strengthened by the arrival of international students and young families eager to forge a new home here in Australia. And they have brought the richness and diversity of Indian culture to supplement and enhance our own cultural diversity. The City of Melbourne India Statement identifies film and creative industries as one of our key shared areas of interest, and the Council has been a proud partner of the India Film Festival since it began. Melbourne has also played host to the filming and release of a number of major Indian Bollywood blockbusters. Salama Naste, Chak De India, and next week the world premiere of Rangali Lay, and the Australian premiere of The Reluctant Fundamentalist. In a globally competitive market, Melbourne has world-class studios, technical expertise, great locations, film-friendly policies, and a growing and strengthened technical expertise. Melbourne can provide a 19th century film location, a gritty inner city criminal's lair, or any other location sought by creative producers. Council has recently launched a filming guide that shows how easy it is to film in Melbourne. Once again, the City of Melbourne's delighted to be a partner of the India Film Festival, which continues to grow in strength and attract high calibre actors and filmmakers to its program and events such as this. I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to introduce a legend in the Indian film industry and globally, Kabir Khan. This is a truly unique opportunity for students and young filmmakers to have an opportunity to meet with him this morning. Kabir started his filmmaking career in documentaries, and I guess they're the first stories that we all know, the ones that happen around us. First working as a cinematographer on a documentary film called Beyond the Himalayas in 1995. He has now gone on to direct a number of his own documentaries located in India, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, and even pushed on to fame in Bollywood, with titles including The Kabul Express, New York, and Ekta Tiger. Kabir Khan really doesn't need any introduction, but I am very proud to introduce him to this morning's session and warmly welcome him to Melbourne. Thank you, Kabir.
Good morning, everybody. Jane, when you said legend, I was looking over my shoulder as to I've come to some wrong master class. Maybe it's somebody else. I'm no legend, but I'm trying. Today I'm going to be speaking essentially about my journey from documentaries to features, in that context, what the documentary means in India today and what kind of space we have available for documentaries. When I went to film school, my film school was more oriented towards documentaries. Of course, today it's changed because every film graduate from my film school, which is in New Delhi, the moment he or she graduates, they take a ticket to Bombay and they land up at the doorsteps of the film industry. But when I was studying there, we were still sort of more oriented towards documentaries, and we did want to move towards the bigger screen, but it felt that was too far away. It would take some time for us to reach the Bombay film industry. When I joined film school, there's one passion that I already had, and that was traveling. I used to do a lot of mountaineering and trekking before I joined film school when I was in undergraduate college, and in fact it's my trekking and mountaineering that got me excited and got me started in photography, because I just felt I was traveling to such beautiful places and I needed to capture them on film, and that's how my passion for still photography began, and I moved sort of closer to the visual medium. So I remember a master class when I was in film school, and there was this documentary filmmaker who came with his film on the restoration of Angkor Wat in Cambodia. And in the master class, we were all asking him, oh, how fortunate you are to be traveling, to places like Cambodia, and how wonderful. And I remember this one line which, for whatever reason, has been etched in my mind, and he said, you want to travel? Do documentaries. And I said, oh, that's it. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do documentaries because I want to travel. And strangely, the way it played out for me was I stepped out of film school and I started freelancing as a cinematographer. And there was this journalist who I knew. He was a legend at that point in time. He still is, called Saeed Naqvi. Now, Saeed was a man who was obsessed about reporting international news from an Indian stroke South Asian perspective, because he felt that at that point in time, all the news that we got, all the international news that we got, was always from the sort of prism of CNN, BBC, and whatever they said, and the way they said it was gospel. That's the way we were supposed to accept international news. And he would keep talking about the fact that that's not true. There's sometimes a huge gap between what these people are reporting and what we get to, what we don't see on the ground reality in all these places. So I joined him, and I started traveling. And the first trip that we did was to an area which I was anyway very fascinated about, the Central Asian republics. The Central Asian republics of the erstwhile Soviet Union, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, all these areas. And because of my trekking in areas of Ladakh and Kashmir, I was always drawn to the Central Asian parts. And we went there, and before we landed up in Central Asia, we had seen this BBC documentary. I don't remember the exact name, but I think it was something like The Rise of the Crescent. And it was about how militant Islamic fundamentalism is taking over Central Asian republics. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, there has been a resurgence in the Islamic identity of Central Asia, and how the poor Russians are being pushed out, and there's this wave of jihadis who are now all over Central Asia. We landed there, and we were finding it really difficult to see any signs of what we had seen in the documentary. And Saeed one day while we were driving around said, okay, wait a minute, let's stop the car. He said, grab your camera, let's get around to the streets. And he got out to the streets, and he started just randomly stopping people and saying, where's the nearest masjid? Where's the nearest mosque? And people would start scratching their heads and looking around and trying to figure out, now where's the next mosque? And we must have stopped about 20-25 people on the streets of this city, which is supposed to be sort of overrun by fundamentalist Islamic forces. And they could not, it took us about 45 minutes to even get the address of the nearest mosque. And that's when I started realizing, that there is some truth in Saeed's words. And that gap between what was told to us and what should have been told to us is, now when I look back on all my features, all my films lie in that gap. The story that was told to us, but the story that should have been told to us. And so if you look at films like Kabul Express, which is in a way trying to understand a soldier from the Taliban, and in a way trying to humanize him and separate him from, show that 60,000 soldiers don't come from a factory. There are certain personal reasons, personal beliefs, personal circumstances behind each one of them. There has to be a story behind each human being. Or whether it's the story of New York, which is against the backdrop of post 9/11 illegal detentions, which the stories about which started coming out much later. Or whether it's even Ek Tha Tiger, which is my most sort of mainstream or commercial film of the three, is also based on the story, a story I'd heard in Kabul, which I could never verify because it came from the world of intelligence, but it was a very interesting story that I felt was important enough to narrate on the big screen. So I'll come back to these films later, but so that's how my journey with Saeed began. And within 4 or 5 countries, I did about 60 countries. 4 or 5 years, I did about 60 countries with him, and so my dream of traveling through documentaries really came true. Though these were not really, I would not now classify them as documentaries, but I would say they were more like soft news features that we were doing for television. And then came the opportunity to shoot a huge travel series called Beyond the Himalayas. And the way it happened was that I met the director of that documentary, Gautam Ghosh, and I was a young cinematographer, and I was shooting with him. I was shooting a profile of him for a television network, and I asked him, so what are your future plans? What are the films you're working on? And he started talking about this documentary that he's doing called Beyond the Himalayas, where he will be driving for 4 months, starting from in the east, the town of Bukhara and Samarkand in Uzbekistan, driving all across the Soviet Central Asian republics, crossing over into China and going into Xinjiang, towards Inner Mongolia, all across Tibet, coming down into Nepal. And I was like, I think I was drooling while I was talking about this. And I said, oh wow. And that's when my trips with Saeed came to my rescue, because I said, oh, wow, I've been to some parts of this world. And he was really taken aback because he couldn't believe that, a young cinematographer had actually been to these parts. It was really difficult to access those areas in those days. And he said, really? I said, yeah, I've been to, and I rattled off the names. I've been to Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan. He says, wow. And I'm actually a shy sort of a person, and so I don't really push myself, but that day I said, and you know what, I would love to shoot your documentary. He said, oh yeah. And he himself, in fact, was one of the best known director cinematographers of our country. So I knew I was pushing it because I was sure that he would be shooting the film himself. But I said, I don't have anything to lose. And he said, oh yeah, that'll be nice. If I'm looking at a second cameraman or 2 units, then we'll get in touch. And I knew that's the end of the story. It won't happen. I went back to Delhi, where I was just living in those days, and I think dreamt about that trip for the next 1 month. And then after about 30-40 days, I realized, okay, obviously nothing's going to happen. And I was gearing up to go for a documentary to Kashmir. The day before I was going to leave for Kashmir for about 2 weeks, I get a call. This is the days before the mobile phone. I get a call on my home landline. Mobile phones came a little late to India. I'm not ancient, so I just, the phone came, and it was Gautam Ghosh on the line. And he says, hey Kabir, what are you doing? I said, well, actually I'm leaving for Kashmir tomorrow. And he says, oh, when do you get back? I said, I get back in 2 weeks. I said, why? He says, you know that film I was speaking to you about? Would you like to shoot it? And I was like, oh my God, would I like to shoot it? I said, yes. I said, but when do you leave? He says, we leave in 20 days. So that gave me just about 5-6 days after I came back from Kashmir to get everything ready and leave. But anyway, I managed all that, and there I was, you know, on the trip of my lifetime. That has really been a journey that I'll sort of never forget. And we made a film called Beyond the Himalayas. And then, you know, this is how sort of one thing leads to another. 2 years after that, about a year and a half after that, because Beyond the Himalayas was a very successful documentary, I think Discovery Channel again asked Gautam to do another film. And this time it was to be a road journey from Singapore to New Delhi, through Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Burma, all the way back to India. And fortunately for me, Gautam was in the middle of a feature and he could not do it. So they said, oh, so what do we do? So he says, you know, if you take my advice, why don't you take Kabir? Because he has done this with me and I think he would be very good. He would be able to direct it and shoot it. But the network didn't take me very seriously because I guess I was too young at that point in time. They said, okay, we'll think about it. But there's an actor, a very well-known actor who's has of course passed away since, called Sunil Dutt, who was to be part of this expedition, because it was like a travelogue, an expedition come travelogue across all these countries. And Sunil Dutt again sort of put forward my name and said, no, I think Kabir will be able to do it. And that's how I got my first big major documentary called The Forgotten Army. So when I got this project, I looked at the place, I looked at the history, and I realized that one of the most fascinating chapters of Indian history has played out in this region. And I said that this film should not be just a travelogue. This should not be a drive through these countries. This film should actually be the story of this army called the Indian National Army. Now the story is that in 1942, this is when the Japanese forces were approaching Singapore, about 60 to 70,000 crack British Indian Army troops had been stationed there. British Indian Army, as you would know, was the largest army in the world, and the Indian soldiers of the British Indian Army, the best of them, the cream of the army, was positioned in Singapore, which was at that time known as the Pearl of the Orient. And they were all expecting the invasion to take place from the sea, because Singapore is an island, but unknown to them, the Japanese came in through Malaysia on cycles. So within 10 days, they were at the gates of Singapore, and Singapore collapsed. All these soldiers were taken prisoner, and from these prisoners was formed an army called the Azad Hind Fauj, or the Indian National Army, which actually was an army that grew to the strength of about 55,000 people, men and women, because they also started recruiting from Indians living in these areas, you know, Indians who had settled in these areas for hundreds of years, or about 100 years. And so there was a women's regiment also called the Rani Jhansi Regiment. And this army actually went to battle against the British on the Burma front. And of course, militarily, it was a disaster and it was a big tragedy. And this army was completely forgotten, because being an army that had taken up arms against the British Empire, they went against the Gandhian principle of non-violence. And when we finally won independence, nobody really, you know, paid attention to the efforts of this army, and slowly this army started getting forgotten. And therefore the title of the film, The Forgotten Army. So what I did was, I tracked down survivors of this army, and I found Captain Lakshmi Sehgal, who was the commander of the women's regiment, the Rani Jhansi Regiment, the only fighting infantry unit, women's infantry unit in any theatre of World War II. And she was 86 when I found her. And then I found Colonel Gurbaksh Singh Dhillon, who was also one of the main military commanders of this army. And I went to them and I said, would you like to come back to Burma? And they sort of looked at me as if I'm a mad guy, because, you know, at the age of 86, they were not sure whether they could. And they had always dreamt of going back to Burma, because what happened is, after independence in 1947, Burma shut down in 1948 after the assassination of General Aung San. And so none of these people could go back to Burma to go and visit, you know, the places that they had struggled for independence. And they told me that we would always dream about going back, you know, for 5 years, for 10 years, for 15, 20, 25, but not after 55 years that they expect to go back. But they agreed. I think they just felt that, you know, they've got an opportunity to go back, and they came with me, and that's how Forgotten Army happened. And that film, for me, was the defining moment in my life, because it was an unbelievable experience. But while I was filming Forgotten Army, there were moments that took place where I just thought that I know, you know, there are certain stories better told in documentary format, and there are certain stories better told in a fiction format, or a sort of a narrative drama format. And there were so many moments that were happening behind the scenes, that were happening behind the camera, that it just got me thinking. I said, one day I have to write a script, a film script called The Forgotten Army, and that's what I did. I have one of my sort of dream projects, a film that I still haven't made, but hopefully should be starting next year, is a feature script called Forgotten Army. I can show you a bit of The Forgotten Army. You can let me know once you have it queued up. And you know,
which expected the invasion from the sea. The guns were all facing eastward, and the Japanese, on the 8th of February 19th, he arrived on the morning of the 18th. The INA's last stand at Popa was to have a lasting effect on him. The northwest. Lakshmi.
I think there are two tracks playing.
Across the front line, resistance amongst the...
Do you want to just buffer it up if it's taking time, and then just let me know when it's queued. Now, there was a moment that took place, for example, in this film, that it initially happened behind the cameras. I mean, and when it sort of unfolded in front of me, I knew that I had to show this moment in a film sometime. It was a magical moment. We recreated it again, in the sense we sort of, you know, in a documentary, filmed them again going to this place. It was in a place called Mount Popa. This is where the last stand of the INA took place. And Captain Lakshmi Sehgal was married to Colonel Prem Kumar Sehgal, and he was in charge of the Mount Popa operations, and Colonel Gurbakh Singh Dhillon was also at Mount Popa. So when we went back to this area after 55 years, they wanted to find a cave, because this was in 1945, they had been reduced to a guerrilla unit in the jungles, and their headquarters was a cave. And Colonel Gurbakh Singh Dhillon said, I want to find that cave. Now, it is an impossible task, because like, you know, finding a needle in a haystack in the thick Burmese jungles to go and find a cave after 55 years. But he would just keep going back in. And finally, after about 4 days of this, I had to tell Dhillon Saab that, you know, it's really impossible to do this. And we were having problems in Burma, because there were, you know, Burmese agents were tracking us and, you know, trailing us. They didn't want us to shoot anything that could go against the politics of the country. And so I said, you know, we really need to finish this film and get ahead. He said, okay, give me just one more day. And he would again disappear into the jungles. And on the 5th day, he actually found this cave. And this cave was a place which all the soldiers used to hide in when the air raids took place. And what Colonel Sehgal had done was that he had found a little Buddha statue up on a mountain, and he had brought it down, and he had placed this Buddha inside the cave. And he said that, you know, this will boost the morale of my soldiers, and the soldiers used to always make sure that a candle was always lit in front of that little Buddha statue. So these people find the cave, and they go in, and it's pitch dark. They can't see anything. So we go back, we find the nearby village. We come back with matches and candles and stuff, and we go inside into the cave, and we find that Buddha statue still over there. It was an unbelievable moment, and I can't even begin to imagine what they were going through. And I said, this moment, it really, that's where I found that it was difficult for me to capture that moment on a documentary. And I said, this moment has to be, you know, written down in a film script. And in fact, that's the moment when the idea for the film script began. If you have that queued, we can just show that.
The Irrawaddy, but not the spirit of the INA. And Colonel Dhillon and his men were ready for what would be the final in the Burmese war.
The most memorable day for me was the 17th of February 1945, when I withdrew from Bagan and had arrived here. On the 18th, Colonel Sehgal came up with his 2nd Infantry Regiment, and he gave me the command of Chowk-Badang area and himself held Popa.
Colonel Sehgal had come up from Rangoon to take command. He arrived on the morning of the 18th. The INA's last stand at Popa was to have a lasting effect on him. Lakshmi Sehgal, who married him after the war, remembers the stories he used to tell. On the top of a hill, Colonel Prem Kumar Sehgal found a little Buddha. He placed the statue in a cave, and he decided to make that his headquarters. He believed that it was this Buddha who protected him during those difficult days. Colonel Dillon attempts to retrace the path to this cave. He last walked on these jungle tracks 50 years ago. His steps may have slowed, but his determination remains unchanged.
Oh, this is the place. This is the place where our headquarters was. This is the place where Buddha protected us. No commander could ask for a better air raid shelter or a trench than this. Oh, how wonderful, how wonderful. It is still the same after half a century.
The INA soldiers operating from this cave would ensure that a lighted candle was always placed under the Buddha.
This cave sheltered our headquarters during the bloodiest days of February, March, and April 1945. It was here that we had our first aid center. Our serious patients could be treated here, and after battles, we could write orders during the night without fear of the air raids or the artillery bombardment. Enemy was supreme in the air, and they had artillery. We didn't have any gun. We didn't have even machine guns at that time. And this was a boon to us. Today, when I come to this place after half a century, I cannot help bowing to Lord Buddha, thanking to the people of Popa how they helped us. I bow to this place.
As she places a candle here to the memory of her husband, the past catches up with Lakshmi Sehgal. Suddenly, the stories her husband had told for decades begin to unfold here with fresh life.
Yeah, I think we can.
Until the very end, he had cherished his memories of the last stand.
So, you know, at the other point I'd like to make is that how now, when I look at all my films, I look at the films I've already done, I look at the scripts that I've been writing, all of them, the raw material for all of them comes from my documentaries. So therefore my documentaries have actually played a very, very important role even in my features. Forgotten Army, And then, of course, which I'll show you next. If you could cue up the Taliban film, then I'll show them that. In 2001, I think that would be the turning point between documentaries to when I started moving towards features, and I'll explain the reasons why. Post 9/11, I decided to get back into Afghanistan. I had gone to Afghanistan in 1996. I had been commissioned by the International Committee of the Red Cross to do a film on the effects of war on children. And I went in 96, February, March, and I couldn't finish that film because it was, you know, just seeing what war had done to the children in Afghanistan. I mean, we shot that, we had a footage, but I just could never sort of put it all together. And anyway, we sort of left prematurely because, you know, at that point in time, the Taliban was just like 20 kilometers outside of Kabul, and there was a lot of random shelling and firing in Kabul. They would just be rocketing Kabul all day long. And at one point, we decided, okay, let's leave because it's too hot right now, and sort of we'll come back. But we couldn't. You know, 2 months after we left, the Taliban had overrun Kabul, and almost the entire Afghanistan was under their command. And there was no way, as an Indian, I could have gone back into Taliban-held Pakistan. So in 2001, post 9/11, I decided, okay, I want to get back into Afghanistan. And I went to this producer, and me and my friend Rajan, and we said, okay, you know, why don't we go in and sort of look at what the 5 years of the Taliban rule were, and did you think there would be any takers? So he made some phone calls, and there was this company called Teleproductions International, which is based in Washington, and they said, they couldn't believe that the two madmen were ready to go into Afghanistan. They said, yes, we want that film. So we picked up our cameras literally and said, okay, how do we go in? Now, we could not go through the usual Peshawar route because, again, we wouldn't get visas to go through that, to cross the Pakistan and Afghanistan border. So we flew to Uzbekistan. From Uzbekistan, we drove to Tajikistan. Again, I keep going back to these countries, so there's, I think, some connection there. And we reached the place called Dushanbe, and we tried to get into Afghanistan. We tried to drive in, and we got snowed out in a blizzard. We tried to cross the river. It was in flood. We wanted to take a helicopter, which crashed before we could get onto it. So it was a dead end. And for 2 weeks, we just kept trying to go in, and there was just no way. And that's when my dear friend Saeed Naqvi, I had not been working with for quite some time. I got the news that Saeed Naqvi is coming to Dushanbe to try and get into Afghanistan. So I remember leaving a note at the reception saying, I used to call him Saeed Bhai. Bhai is, means brother. I said, welcome Saeed Bhai to the dead end. And I left the note over there, and I was away in Dushanbe. I came back in the evening, and he was all like, why do you call this a dead end? What do you mean? Why are you saying this? I said, because I've been here for 14 days and you just cannot get it. Now Saeed, because Saeed was also known as the headhunter of India, because he is a man who would always go and interview the heads of state. So, you know, Nelson Mandela's second interview after he out of prison was with Saeed, Yasser Arafat, Fidel Castro. Gorbachev's first interview to any journalist in the world was Saeed. So Saeed had a lot of networks in the diplomatic corps, and he said, no, I'm going to make a few phone calls to ambassadors and stuff, and we'll get into Afghanistan. I said, okay, great. Saeed Bhai's come to our rescue. Nothing worked. It was just impossible to get into Afghanistan. And finally, after a few days, we gave up, and Saeed said, okay, let's go back. That day, Rajan and I said, okay, let's give it one last shot. So we got up in the morning and we packed all our equipment and said, we're going to the airport. Let's see if there's any chopper, anything going in. And Saeed said, you guys are wasting time. Trust me, I have 40 years of journalistic instinct. You're not going in there. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to have a lazy breakfast and lunch. You guys come back, and we're catching the 3 o'clock flight back. I said, okay, we'll give it a shot. That day we land at the military airport, and we hear that there's a Russian military helicopter going in with medical supplies. We said, okay, we try and we got into the base, and we cornered the Russian pilot. And fortunately for us, he spoke a bit of English. And I hate to say it, but we bribed him. I gave him $2,000 and said, please hide us in your medical supplies. And he said, okay. So the door of the helicopter was opened, and we were hidden inside the helicopter, and we quickly take out our satellite phone. That was the only phone available at that point, and we called Saeed Bhai, and I said, Saeed Bhai, we are on a chopper to Afghanistan, and he couldn't believe it. So and that was, I mean, after that I don't think there was any other chopper going in. So he took the 3 o'clock flight back to India, and we took this chopper. In fact, the first shot is from that chopper. If we have it queued, then I'll just show you a bit and I'll talk further about this. That's the chopper I was shooting through.
The most important leader of the anti-Taliban alliance was the man known as the Lion of Panjshir, Ahmad Shah Massoud. His troops denied Taliban control over the strategic Panjshir Valley north of Kabul and the mountainous country even further north. On Sunday, the 9th of September 2001, 2 journalists carrying Belgian passports arrived to conduct a television interview with Massoud. But this was not an ordinary interview. The 2 men were not journalists, and what they were carrying for the interview was not really a video camera. It was a bomb. 6 days later, the legendary military leader died of the injuries he sustained in this suicide attack and was buried near his home village in the heart of the Panjshir Valley. In normal circumstances, the loss of Ahmad Shah Massoud would have pushed the balance, perhaps decisively, in the Taliban's favor. But by then, the circumstances were anything but normal. On the 11th of September 2001, suicidal terrorists were to strike again. This time, not in the remote mountains of Afghanistan, but thousands of miles across the globe in the commercial and military heart of the United States of America. Suddenly, the world's attention turned to a country in South Asia ravaged by war for 2.5 decades. The prime suspect in both the attacks was the same man. With Osama bin Laden clearly in their sights, the US began its bombing campaign in Afghanistan, where the ruling Taliban had protected and allowed bin Laden's Al-Qaeda terrorists their operating bases.
We just jump ahead a little
Taliban
by a minute or
warriors
so.
who had promised a fight to the death against the US-led coalition suddenly disappeared. The Taliban is a plural form of the Arabic word talib, which means religious student. One such student is 42-year-old Salahuddin Khalid from the Balochistan province of Pakistan, a veteran of many terrorist operations.
मैंने पाकिस्तान में सूबे पंजाब में दीनी तालीम ख़त्म किया, फिर मैंने स्पेशल कोर्सों और ट्रेनिंगों में
Okay, we can stop it here. I'll just.
और 2 साल तक मैंने ट्रेनिंग की.
So why I'm saying that the film in Afghanistan in a way sort of was the beginning of my journey towards features is because you know, I got in and I started doing this documentary, and then afterwards, and this documentary did very well because there was nobody else really doing documentaries at that point. Most people were sort of reporting hard news. So I went back again and I did a documentary called The Titanic Sinks in Kabul, which is more about the environmental destruction of Afghanistan. At that point, I started feeling a bit of unease because what was happening was that I was getting a lot of international commissions. So my documentary is being commissioned with big budgets from international networks. But the space for documentaries in India itself was dwindling. And I was not being able to show my documentaries in India. None of the channels were supporting documentaries anymore because it takes a lot of time and a lot of money to make these documentaries, this kind of documentary where you need to travel out. So there was a bit of frustration because for any communicator, you need to be having, feedback from your audience. And that's when I realized that, I need to start telling my stories on the big screen in India, because I realized there's no other, the big screen is such a powerful medium in India, and if you really want to reach out to people and throw up discussions and throw out, the kind of stories that you want to tell, then it needs to be on the big screen. And the documentaries in Afghanistan is what then I started penning down. So my first film, Kabul Express, is actually in a way autobiographical, because it's the story of what happened with me and my friend Rajan in Afghanistan. And it also begins with the whole helicopter episode, because we got into this helicopter, and then through the Hindu Kush mountains, after about 40 minutes, you come outside Kabul, and this Russian pilot lowers the helicopter just outside Kabul near the mountains, about 20 feet hovering above there, and he says, jump. So I said, what? He says, jump. I said, why can't we, go to Kabul? We don't even know where this is. He says, no, this is just outside Kabul. You will find your way into Kabul, but I can't take you to the Kabul airport because you're non-military personnel, and I can't be landing there with you. I'll have questions to, being thrown at me. So he says, I said, okay, then take it down a little. 20 feet is very high. And he says, no, this is too big a helicopter. If it goes below 20 feet, then it has to settle down all the way, and I can't do that. So you have to jump. So that's how we get into Afghanistan. We sort of hang off the railings and we jump. And that's exactly the way Kabul Express, my film, begins, which I'll show you in some time in the trailer. And from there on, the story begins. Why I wanted to show you just that bit of that Khalid, that Taliban guy. There's a story there which in a way is the seed of the idea for Kabul Express. So this was a prison in Panjshir, which was at that point in time about an 8 or 9 hour drive from Kabul near the Tajik border. And it was every journalist was ready to give their right arm to go to that prison. It was a prison called Doab, which means two rivers, because it's a prison which is surrounded by two rivers on two sides and a mountain range behind. So even if you escape, you can't go anywhere. And this is where the Northern Alliance was keeping all the foreign mercenaries who were fighting along with Taliban stroke Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. So the Pakistanis, the Arabs, the Chinese, the Burmese, whoever were the foreign militants fighting along with Taliban were imprisoned and kept over here. And this was the prison from which they were sorted out and they were put on the plane straight to Guantanamo Bay. So we went in there, and we went in there because there was enormous amount of goodwill and warmth amongst the Northern Alliance Afghans for India. So, while the Americans were practicing a lot of checkbook journalism and, paying huge amounts to get into these places, these guys just said, put us in a jeep, and they said, go, just because we were Indians. And also it was easy for us, like me with a beard now, if I dress up like an Afghan, I look like an Afghan. I understand the language. It's very similar to Urdu. So it was easy for us to get by without, attracting attention. So we reach over here, and after an 8 hour drive, and the jailer just opens the gate to the prison courtyard, and he says, okay, you go in. And we walk in, and there are 30 the terrorists from the most dreaded terrorist organization in the world staring at us. And there was a moment of silence. We didn't know what to do. Just the two of us standing there like errant schoolboys, and these guys are staring at us. Okay, now what do these guys want? And we realized that slowly we started getting drawn to the Pakistanis, because obviously they are the ones who spoke our language. We didn't understand what the Arabs were saying, and they were not interested in talking to us. The Pakistanis were a little more curious about us since we had come from India, and we started chatting with them. And the most articulate of the lot was Khalid. He looks small actually on screen here, but he's about 6'2", 6'3", a really broad guy. And so we started chatting with them, and of course he would speak a different language on camera and speak a different language when the camera was off. It's amazing how he knew what to say to project the Taliban ideology on camera, but the moment the camera was off, he's a completely different person, and that was really intriguing. And then he cooked for us. They cooked korma and roti, because there was no other place to stay. You had to stay in prison. So we stayed 2 nights in prison with them. Finally, when we were going out and we were about to cross the river, Khalid came running out behind us, and he said, you know, I have a request. I said, yeah, okay, what? He said, can I please make one phone call from your satellite phone? And I was like, oh my God, you know, that's not a good idea, because you don't know who's tracking our satellite phone, and we give a Taliban militant our satellite phone, who's going to track us down? We're going to be in deep shit. So I said, I don't think so. But the jailer said, he was the most sympathetic, and he said, you know, it won't really make a difference. Why don't you just let him make a 2-minute call? So I said, okay. And I gave Khalid the phone, and he made a phone call to his family. And as he started chatting, I realized that he had been missing for the last 4 to 5 years. The family thought he's dead. And this was the first phone call in 5 years that family got from him and realized that he's alive. And then he asked for his daughter. And his little daughter came onto the phone, and I saw this 6 feet 3 inch so-called dreaded terrorist crumble into this sobbing father in front of me. He just broke down and he cried when he heard his daughter's voice. And that for me was, I think, the beginning of the idea for Kabul Express, because I said, you know, this is the kind of story one needs to figure out what is happening, what is the human story behind all these people. And that's how I started writing Kabul Express, which was loosely based on my experiences. I'll show you the trailer of Kabul Express, you'll get an idea. This is not 20 because actors are not ready to jump from 20 feet.
We want to go to Kabul.
Vale. Shinida mishi yak pota shoma to Kabul mere.
पर टैक्सी नहीं होती क्या?
तालिबान का इंटरव्यू हम जरूर लिखेंगे, चाहे जान चली जाए। मरेगा तो डेफिनेटली।
मुझे क्या पता था कि सचमुच जान का खतरा होगा।
An American.
Get Osama, I guess. Or if not Osama, then a chat with Mullah Omar.
One Afghan.
तालिबान औरतों को काम करने नहीं देते।
A Pakistani.
गाड़ी चलाने आती कि नहीं आती?
On a journey together.
यहाँ के लोग तो फोकट में ही चुमी लेते रहते हैं।
क्या मिला इन लोगों को इतना खूबसूरत मुल्क बर्बाद करके?
5 people from different worlds, their paths destined to cross in a country devastated by war.
तो मजा आ रहा है ना बेटे? वॉर रिपोर्टिंग करते हुए घंटा मजा आ रहा है।
What?
ओसामा बिन लादेन।
So this was the first feature, which was totally based on, you know, in a way, almost every scene was picked up from what happened with Rajan and me. And so it was quite, in that sense, an easy script to write, because I just had to put together all my experiences as a documentary filmmaker and in a way sort of string them together. The main point being the story of that Taliban and the daughter, and then sort of put my experience around it. And even like, for example, there's this the scene of Buskashi. Buskashi is the game which is, they have these about 20 horses on each side, and they are holding a dead carcass of a sheep as a ball, and they take it from one side to another. Now, this sport had been banned by the Taliban because they said it was too violent. So after the Taliban left, after about 7 years, it was the first game of Buskashi played. The real reason being, of course, that Buskashi is played by the people from the Northern Alliance. It's played more by the Tajiks and the Uzbeks, and not by the Pashtuns, who are which Taliban is predominantly Pashtun. So after 7 years, they played this game when we were there in 2001, and we were filming this, and Rajan was standing behind me, because I said, we're in the middle, and people were running around with the horses. So there were like 30-40 horses and about 200-300 people running in excitement along with these horses. So it was mayhem, it was chaos, and we jumped in the middle of this, and I told Rajan, it's very difficult for me to judge distance from the viewfinder, because when you're on a wide angle, everything gets sort of distorted in terms of distance. When you're on telephoto, you don't know how far they are. So I said, please warn me if they're too close to us. So he said, yeah, okay, don't worry. And I'm filming this in the middle of the ground, and I see this, horses charging towards us, and I said, this is a great shot. And I was comfortable that Rajan will warn me when it's dangerous. And I'm filming, and I'm zooming out, and and they're coming towards me. Great shot, fantastic shot. But then I realized these guys are a little too close. They couldn't be at safe distance. I sort of take my camera off my eye, and they'll tear, like these horses are coming. I jump with the camera and roll to the side. I look back, and I see Rajan doing a flip like some 15 feet, and he had been hit by the horses. But fortunately, he was not too badly hurt. He came. I said, what the hell were you doing? Like, what were you looking at? He says, no, there was this one horse who was behind us, and he was acting very weird. So I thought he's going to come and hit us. So I said, you have your eyes on that one horse and not the 30 horses who are coming running towards us. So I took that scene and I put it in another sort of context in Kabul Express, where he tells his friend to look out for the horses, but he gets distracted because he thinks he's seen the Taliban in the crowd. So it was, scenes like this. I just needed to make these little changes, and the scenes were played out. And then, of course, after Kabul Express, the next film that I did was New York. Now, New York was a film that's based on the post 9/11 illegal detentions that took place in America. And at that point in time, I was doing a bit of research. I had actually started filming and contributing to a documentary, which finally I never completed, but it was made by a friend, Ahmad Jamal. It was called The Jihadi and the Journalist. It was on Daniel Pearl and Omar Sheikh. So around that time, I started researching on these illegal detentions that took place, and so when my producer had this one-line idea about these 3 friends studying in New York, I decided to again draw from the raw material that my documentaries gave me and set it against that backdrop. Now, this was actually for the producer quite a risky film, because Kabul Express was not an expensive film. It was under $1 million to produce, even though we were in Afghanistan. But New York was an expensive film. We shot it for 100 days in New York in a single schedule. It was talking about politics. Politics in Bollywood, as you know, has always been a bit of a taboo. Mostly love stories are played out in a vacuum. They don't really give a strong political or social context. I mean, not a real context. Now, this was a story that was against the backdrop of not only a very hardcore political backdrop, but politics of another country. But fortunately for us, New York went on to become a huge hit commercially, and that sort of really emboldened us to realize that we can actually put a real context in even in the mainstream space, and and they can be commercially successful. I'll just show you the trailer of New York.
यारों जी भर के झीले पर लगता है आजकल दौर अपना आएगा।
अच्छा, दिल्ली में सेक्सी लड़कियों को क्या कहते हैं?
टोटा टोटा। यारों जो खुद पे हो यकीन तो जिंदगी हंसी तुझे कल बुलाएगा। है जुनून
सामान नहीं है।
तुमको अभी अंदाजा नहीं है ये लोग तुम्हारे साथ क्या कर सकते हैं।
तू पागल हो गया क्या माल?
Why should I trust you?
I want my lawyer.
कौन हो तुम?
Don't fail us.
हम सब में एक ही चीज कॉमन थी, हमारा मजहब।
जो होगा जब होगा आप सबको हिला देगा।
I'm an American. Listen to me.
So again, from because of the success of New York, sort of my producer said he wanted to make a a bigger film with bigger stars, and he was talking to me and he said, do you want to put some sort of a political context into another story? Say we take Salman Khan, who's the biggest star of films, and again, interestingly, it's a film called Ek Tha Tiger, and finally when we started writing it, the backdrop to this film also came from an idea that I had heard in Kabul in 2001. In 2001, at that point in time, Kabul was full of spies. Like you were either a journalist or a spy, and there were so many of them that they used to actually recognize each other. Like the Indians and Pakistans knew, okay, this guy is a secret agent from Pakistan, and they both used to access us because they knew as journalists, stroke documentary filmmakers, we were getting access to a lot of places like that prison that I was talking about, and they wanted to know what's happening there. So they would, like the Indian guys would come and say, hey, you see that guy? That guy's a Pakistani khufia. Khufia means an agent, spy. And the Indians would come and say, why were you talking to these guys? But there was this one, in those days, if you wanted to come and eat, there were only 1 or 2 places, kebab khanas in Kabul, where you could come and have a meal before curfew was imposed in the evening, and you had to run back to wherever you were staying. And there it was a very strange experience, because I realized that these people, we were literally like almost sharing tables, and there was this one character they spoke about, who they both sides seemed to know, but were both cagey about. They didn't really want to talk much about. They seemed to be embarrassed about. And that really intrigued me. I said, who can this character be who they both seem to know about, both don't want to talk about? From then on, I started trying to do a lot of research, try to find out more about this person, about incidents and cases that happened in that world. But because from the world of intelligence, it was almost impossible to get anything out. But after about 10 years, I decided, okay, I think, I find it a fascinating story. I think it's an important story, and I shall just fill in the blanks and make a story. So I'm not going to say it's a true story. And so we did this. We took the 2 biggest superstars, Salman Khan and Katrina Kaif of the industry, and made this film, and again gave it a very strong political context. And in fact, when it became, from the time we did the casting, it became the most anticipated film of the year. And everybody was looking forward to our first promotional that would come out. Katrina is famous for being this dancing diva, and Salman is known for a lot of, he's Jackie Chan meets Jim Carrey, and so they thought. So I said, okay, but I decided to make the first promo and give the context of the film. And when I first made it, a lot of people within the studio saw it and they thought I've gone crazy, because the story, the promo was 40 seconds of black and white documentary footage and 20 seconds of Salman Khan, no Katrina Kaif. And they said, you know, what the hell are you trying to do? This is an expensive film, need to really market it in a big way. But I somehow had a gut feeling that this is going to work. If you present it in this way, people will take to it. And so what, because without subtitles, I'll just tell you briefly what the narration is. It's on the black and white footage, what it basically says is that you know, since partition, India and Pakistan have gone to war 4 times, but there are 2 agencies in this country that are at war every single day, somewhere around in the world, because that's India's RAW, which is Research and Analysis Wing, that's India's intelligence agency, and ISI, which is Pakistan's intelligence agency. And they are today, I mean, in post-Cold War world where, you know, KGB doesn't exist and CIA is fighting phantoms in mountains, ISI and RAW are the 2 only agencies in the world which exist only for each other. If one ceases to exist, the other doesn't need to exist. And I said that, you know, and I said in this scenario, all information is guarded in the name of secret, in the name of national security, and it's very difficult for stories to come out. But there is one such story that escaped the fiercely guarded files. This is a story of Tiger. That's all that the narration said, and showed Salman. So I'll can I have the volume up a little? And the lights off.
हिंदुस्तान और पाकिस्तान की फौज पिछले 60 साल में 4 जंग लड़ चुकी हैं। लेकिन इंडिया और पाकिस्तान में 2 ऐसी सरकारी एजेंसीज हैं जो हर रोज हर पल जंग लड़ रही हैं। इंडिया की रॉ और पाकिस्तान की ISI। आम लोगों तक इनके बारे में कोई खबर नहीं पहुंचती, क्योंकि उसे मुल्क की सुरक्षा के नाम पर हमेशा के लिए छुपा दिया जाता है। लेकिन कुछ कहानियां होती हैं जिन्हें दीवारें और फाइलें नहीं रोक पाती। ये वो कहानी है जिसने इस खुफिया दुनिया को जड़ से हिला दिया था। ये कहानी है टाइगर की।
So even the title called Ek Tha Tiger loosely translates to Once Upon a Time There Was a Tiger. So I built it up as a legend, as a myth that can never be confirmed, can never be, you know, there's no way of verifying it, but we feel that this is a story important enough to narrate. The promo went completely viral. We had some upwards of 2 million hits in 48 hours. And you know, set up the film to get the biggest opening weekend of all time in Indian cinema. You know, this was, I'm just making this point because to say that how almost every script I'm working on today, the origin and the raw material comes from my documentaries, and documentaries has been something I think it's been a very, very significant part of my career. And every time I sit down to write a script, I'm always drawing from my experiences from documentaries. So I think I'd like to open it up to questions. I've been rambling on for too long now. So let's open it up, and whatever questions you have in the context of these films, documentaries, or anything else that you'd like to ask me, more than welcome. Yeah. Oh, I think we'll get a mic for you. Can we have the house lights on so I can see who I'm speaking with?
Great. So I have so many questions, but I'll hold back. At what point in
Can you get the mic?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
In whether documentaries or features, but mostly documentaries, what point did you feel? Yeah. Did you ever feel threatened for your safety?
Oh, you mean? Oh, yeah. Yeah, Afghanistan, the entire Afghanistan chapter, not only in the documentaries when I jumped in the middle of the war, from the first few minutes in Afghanistan. So I'll tell you what happened after I jumped off the helicopter. I jump off the helicopter takes off, and here we are standing in the middle of nowhere. There's just nothing but just mountains around us. We don't know where the hell Kabul is, this side, and how do we reach there. And we see this one lone figure, the guy who was speaking on his radio. Of course, that's an enactment, but we see this one lone mujahideen coming, cocking his gun, walking towards us. And I said, oh, that's definitely the shortest trip to any country I've made in my life. It's going to be over in 5 minutes. He comes up and he starts speaking in Dari, and all we kept saying is that Hindustan is how they know India in Afghanistan. That's the word they use for India. So I said Hindustan, and suddenly he starts beaming with this big smile, and he says, Hindustan, and he says Amitabh Bachchan. That's the biggest superstar of Hindi films. And then I know, okay, now we are safe. And he actually started singing a song. And when I was writing this scene, when I wrote this, a friend of mine who didn't know this story, he read it and he said, what a ridiculous scene. I said, why? He said, how do you expect us to believe that this, big mujahideen comes and starts singing songs? But I said, he did. He actually sang for us. He says, no, this is not going to work. So I had to dilute it. This is like, instead of exaggerating from reality, I had to dilute and bring it down. And then I didn't have him singing. I just said, have him exchange a few lines about our film actors. And then we say, can we go to Kabul? And he says, yeah, wait a minute. And this tank appears out of nowhere. And we sit on the tank and we enter Kabul in great style on top of a tank. But, the first few days, there is a lot of danger. You feel freaked out because there's constant firing going on, and there are explosions, and honestly you completely are totally freaked out. But then this is something I used to speak with a lot of journalists, especially people working in conflict zones. Over time you start getting desensitized, and you start getting and it can be a little dangerous, because when you start getting desensitized, you can also lose the sense of danger, which you should never lose, because that, there is a sort of a sixth sense that you have, which says, okay, this far and no further. And I think, I guess I had that sixth sense, which would always, prevent me from crossing a certain line, because a lot of people did cross that line and lose their lives, especially in a place like Afghanistan. I did make some stupid mistakes. I remember I once was driving to Panjshir, and we stopped for a bit, and it was a beautiful location. There was this highway and beautiful snow-clad mountains at the backdrop, and I wanted to take a shot of these cars going with this light on the mountain. So I started walking in the reverse direction off the road, and after about 100 yards or 200 yards, I suddenly heard somebody screaming from the road, and I looked back, and my driver was jumping up and down, waving at me, saying "Khatra hai mine," which means danger of mines. They suspected that area to be a landmine, and this was in February. It was minus 19 degrees, and I was sweating. And fortunately for me, these were abandoned fields that used to be cultivated, so that it was loose mud. So I saw my footprints very strongly embedded in the soil, and I tiptoed back, just retracing my steps, and came out. So you can make these stupid mistakes, and Afghanistan is the most densely mined countries in the world, and that, or just sort of crossing a certain line, going away, what unfortunately happened with Daniel Pearl. He just pushed it to an extent where he went away with somebody who shouldn't have gone away with, and then you end up losing your life. So there is definitely a sense of danger. It's not like it isn't there, but I guess you just need to play it sensibly. That's all you can be guided by in a place like Afghanistan. But having said that, of course, by a little bit of trying to figure out what you're doing, have a little bit of knowledge, get to know the lay of the land. So it's intuition with a little bit of information that you've gathered. Okay, these people would be hostile towards you, or this area is not somewhere where you should be going in without security or without knowing people. And that sort of, I guess, keeps you away from falling prey to danger.
How well did you command the language?
Sorry? Afghanistan, though I do know a smattering of the language, but what really works in our favor and what comes to our rescue always in Afghanistan are our films. 80% of Afghanistan speaks Hindi because they watch our films. So you can easily get by in Afghanistan if you're speaking Urdu stroke Hindi. And that really helps, especially in the southern belt, they all speak the language. And so with a little bit of, Dari words or Pashto, these are the two main languages of Afghanistan, and Hindi and Urdu, we can more or less communicate with everybody.
I was interested to know what attracts you to these conflict zones in your stories, like in your documentaries and in your features, and also why you think Indian audiences have embraced these contexts for your films.
I think, and so it wasn't like I didn't deliberately try and identify conflict zones and get in, but yes, now when I look back, bulk of my work has taken place in conflict zones. Most of my films, documentaries or features that were successful have been sort of been placed in some conflict zone. I think what happens in conflict zones, and for people who have sort of traveled there or worked, is that there are amazing human stories come out of conflict zones. It's like, I guess when we're all comfortable and things are good and nice, it doesn't really push a human into certain situations or certain circumstances where they have to come up to the situation. But in conflict zones, I've always noticed in my experience, things that happen in front of the camera, things that happen with people around me, really incredible human stories emerge, and that's what in a sense has drawn me to conflict zones, I guess, to tell the human story that takes place in these conflict zones. And even to answer the second question, is why my stories have worked despite being set in sort of these conflict zones, why they have worked with the audiences even in a mainstream commercial space, is because I've always concentrated on the human story. I believe that you cannot make a film about the politics. The politics has to be a backdrop. Like for example, New York, as I said, New York was the most, in that sense, a risky film, a very political film. But I think what worked in New York was the human story of the three friends, the Indian friends, sort of discovering a new world, fascinated by this new world, and how the world around them comes crashing around them. Once the audience identified with the characters and latched on to them, after that you can take them into any world. They will follow you there. They don't get alienated. They don't get confused about what you're doing. So I think the trick for me has been to narrate the human story strongly in the foreground, but always keep a very energetic political backdrop, which has a bearing on the story of the protagonist.
What is your words of wisdom for emerging filmmakers?
I have words, I don't know whether they are words of wisdom. All I would say is that this is something that I said in the earlier masterclass also, is that you just have to, especially in the mainstream, and I'm talking in the context of the Indian film industry scenario, is that you just have to keep at it. It is difficult. It is very difficult to get a break into the mainstream space. I mean, for me, imagine I was a documentary filmmaker. Now, in India, if you're aware, when I was growing up, documentaries meant state propaganda films division films about the five-year plan, or the cultivation of wheat, or what the prime minister said in a place. So documentaries meant, that boring space that comes before a feature film, where you can go have a cigarette or go to the bathroom and come back in time. So I was in the middle of that, and I came, and sometimes I thought I should not tell anybody I was a documentary filmmaker, but because my film was based on a documentary, I had to sort of tell them. And you have to go at it. It took me a year from, which now in retrospect seems like hardly anything, because people go through struggles of 3, 4, 5 years before they get their first script commissioned. But I had my fair share. I would go to these places, and Kabul Express is placed just before the multiplex explosion. Today we talk a lot about multiplex films, so you can make a film where there's a discerning audience in the cities, or a more educated audience which sometimes likes these films and will support them. So Kabul Express was before that time, and I went to meet a lot of producers, and I would get there were a lot of interesting experiences there. I mean, you can make a film in itself. Like I remember going to this producer who was I mean, people used to perceive him as this champion of alternative cinema. So I went there. They had just gone for a public issue. They were flush with funds. So I thought, he's the man for me to get this film made. And I meet them. And of course, I didn't meet him, but I met his CEO. And the CEO sits, and I went to meet him on, I think, a Wednesday or a Thursday. And he says, so what is your proposal? And I was like, okay. I said, my proposal is that I propose to make a film. And he says, no. What I mean by proposal is, what is the budget of your film? What are the 14 territory-wise breakdown of expected revenues? And who's the actor? What is his? What are the statistics about his revenue earnings in these districts? I mean, unbelievable stuff that a first-time filmmaker would know nothing about. And I was like, okay, I shall try and figure out this. But I said, would you like to hear the story? He says, no, stories we hear on Saturday. Monday to Friday we discuss proposal, and stories we hear on Saturday. So on Saturday I went back to him to narrate the story. He heard the story. He said, very nice story. But let me tell you something. There are two kinds of films. One is a pre-Friday film, and one is the post-Friday film. I said, okay, sir, I'm unaware of that. Could you please tell me what that means? He said, see, pre-Friday films are films that make money before they are released. So we sell them before the release on a Friday, and we get our money on table because we've pre-booked, we've pre-sold it to distributors because it's got a big star cast and it's an attractive film. And then there are films that are post-Friday films which have to work on their own. They have to earn their money after they release based on word of mouth and how well they do. He says, your film is post-Friday film. Unfortunately, the charter of our company is we don't do post-Friday films. We only do pre-Friday films. So that was the end of my negotiation there. But having said that, out of the blue, the biggest studio of India, Yash Raj Studios, which was actually known and is famous for actually doing big romances and love stories, being shot in Switzerland and beautiful places, never in gritty and edgy places like Kabul. I got a call from them and say that Aditya Chopra. Now, Aditya Chopra is the head of Yash Raj Films, and he's extremely shy of the press. There would be just maybe 1 or 2 images of him. So there's sometimes people say that he's actually a myth to scare people. He doesn't exist, which Yash Raj has created. So I get a call saying Aditya Chopra wants to meet you, and I didn't know, but my script had reached Aditya Chopra through another friend. And I walk into Yash Raj Studios, the door is open, Aditya Chopra in flesh and blood is in front of me, and he says, I've read your script, it's a fascinating script, it really moves well, when can we start? And there, within 3 months, I was in Kabul, which of course is another story altogether. And actually, to answer that question about danger, even my feature film, the first one, we ran into a lot of trouble because we were setting it up in 2005, and at that point in time, Taliban was considered like it's over and done with. It's passé, it's gone, it's never going to re-emerge. And suddenly, when we start filming, within the first 15 days of filming, the 3 suicide bombings happened in Kabul. And which was bizarre because suicide bombings had not taken place even during the 5 years of Taliban. It was not used by the Taliban. It was always used by the sort of Al-Qaeda and the Arab elements. But these were elements coming back from Iraq to Kabul. And now, in retrospect, we know that what we were seeing was the beginning of the resurgence of Taliban. But at that point in time, we just didn't know what happened. And then one day I get a call from the Indian ambassador saying that, can you come to the embassy after pack-up? And I reach the embassy, and he sits there and he says, okay, we've got an intelligence tip-off from our own agencies, from RAW and from the Afghan intelligence, and we've also corroborated this with the Americans, that there are 5 people who have been dispatched from across the border to hit out at your unit. And what was happening was essentially that because we started filming in Afghanistan and we were the first international feature to film in Afghanistan post-Taliban, a lot of CNN, BBC, German news, everybody started doing stories on us as to how, a big film is being made in Kabul. And Taliban, or the leftovers of Taliban, did not want that message going out, that things are getting back to normal. And so they sent out a death threat for John, for Arshad, for me and Rajan, the 4 of us. And we had to shut down our shoot and for 4 or 5 days. But I must say that the Afghan government gave us unprecedented security. They gave us some 60 armed commandos round the clock, and it was bizarre because my crew was only 40 or 50. It was a small crew relatively, and the security minister came to me on the 4th day after we shut down filming, and he came to my hotel and he says, you know, if you go back tomorrow, it'll be a defeat for Afghanistan. And I was saying, that's the last thing I need. Here I am worrying about the safety of my crew, and now, I get this added emotional baggage. But he sent these 60 commandos, and we resumed shooting, and we would reach locations 5:30 in the morning, minus 10 degrees, and would see these snipers sitting on the mountain tops, who had been sitting there all night, making sure that the locations were clear for us. And the security minister came and he said, now are you feeling comfortable? And we said, yeah, these guys are there. Because our motorcade used to be some 35 SUVs. We were shooting up in the mountains, so our buses could never go. It only had to be 4-wheel drives. And we used to have some 30-35 SUVs with guns sticking out of each window, passing through Kabul. And he said, but all these 60 commandos that you see, they're doing nothing. There are rings of security running for 5 kilometers around you. And that's the kind of security we got. And we sort of managed to finish Kabul Express. Yeah, except for a 3-day patchwork in India, which was like close-ups and stuff. But otherwise, yeah, the whole film was finished there. Anybody else?
Kabir sir, in regards to film like New York and something like My Name is Khan that just came out, pretty much a similar premise, post 9/11, the war on terror. I'm just curious as to how the West, particularly in America, because we see a lot of documentaries made about Guantanamo and all the illegal detention, and now with it and all the talks of the American government are wanting to close it, what is generally the sort of perception that the West, especially America, gives you? Do they think of it more as like, you're more like a sympathizer towards, the act of terrorism or anything like that? Is that the perception that you usually get with films like that? Because you see how Shah Rukh Khan was detained in New York because of that film. Yeah. It was pretty much like oxymoron because, the nature of how people are illegally detained because of situations like that, because of your name, because of your profiling and your race. So I'm just curious to know how Americans in general respond to films like New York.
Yeah, that itself was an interesting experience. When we went to get the visas for us when we were traveling to New York for the filming, for the location scouting, there were about 4 assistant directors who were accompanying me. There was my wife and my kids also. I was getting visas for, because I knew that somewhere in the course of the 4 months they would come back and come to visit me. So we went to the American consulate for our visas, and everybody got their visas, but when it was my turn, I came to the counter, and this lady was saying, and suddenly, I guess once she punched in my name, Khan. Khan is a very, I think, commonly known South Asian Muslim name, and it is on that list, those 29-30 names that they have on their list that they have to watch out for. Any permutation combination of that name raises a red alert. And suddenly she said, sir, I think you'll have to come back. And she gave me this yellow slip, and she said, we'll have to look into this. I said, and I'd already traveled to the US some 6 times, including filming trips. And I said, but what's the problem? So she said, no, it's not your problem, it's our problem. I said, yeah, but I mean, you've given a visa to 6 people whose reason to go to the US is accompanying director. And the director is not getting the visa. Who are they accompanying? So she said, no, sir, it's your name. I said, what's wrong with the name? She said, no, Kabir Khan, it's a little vague. So I said, thank you very much. I shall tell my mother about that. But what exactly do you mean by vague? So she said, no, there can be so many Kabirs and Khans, and we need to check. So anyway, bottom line is they didn't give me the visa. And I came back with this yellow slip. I thought it'll take maybe a week, 10 days, but just kept extending and became 20 days, 30 days, and we were getting late for our location scout because we had to meet our schedule. And finally, we engaged an immigration lawyer in New York, and he went into it and realized that I had been put into the FBI watch list. Now, what happens is that, firstly, there are thousands of, because that's what I found bizarre about certain security checks. How can you base it on a name? Apparently, anybody named Osama doesn't get a visa. I mean, if anybody wants to do anything, the last thing they're going to do is call themselves Osama and say, give me a visa. They'll probably, change their name. But so Khan was lying there, buried under those files. And he said, you know, what happens is that they do a check on you. Now, even though they've got evidence of why you went to Afghanistan, why you've been to, and the problem with me is because of my documentaries, I've been to Iran, Afghanistan, all the, you know, so-called axis of evil that the Americans define. They said that what they start thinking is that even though we know why you went to Afghanistan and you went for a documentary, you went for a feature, they start thinking that, but he is a Muslim. What if he got compromised in his interaction with the Taliban? What if he got brainwashed and is actually part of a sleeper cell? Now, how do you fight that logic? I mean, then I could be part of a sleeper cell for 20 years and emerge suddenly as this jihadi. So that itself was a lesson to me, you know, as to how things are being perceived, and New York is basically about that. See, I understand when the civilian population gets scared or becomes paranoid after an attack like 9/11. It happens even in India. India has been a victim of several terrorist attacks, and there is, you know, the civilian population tends to become a little paranoid and shrill. But when that paranoia creeps into state policy, that's when the problem happens, and that's what New York is about. That about catching boys just because they have a certain name. But having said that, once I got the visa and we went there, the American people that we interacted with reacted positively to the film. They thought it was a very balanced film, the way it projected the picture. It did very well over there. A lot of apparently non-Indian diaspora Americans came in and saw the film. And of course, what the cherry on the cake was that New York became a huge success in the Middle East, even in the territories that we do not traditionally release in. So places like Jordan, Iraq, Syria, because I think they found a resonance with that story, because most of the people who were thrown into illegal detention were from the Middle East. And we got news of this, that it's actually, and these are all pirated DVDs. These are not places where we had actually released the film. And we got to know this because the Jordanian ambassador met the editor of one of the leading newspapers of India, and he said, you know, every man, woman and child in Jordan and Syria has seen New York. And we were amazed that it took Indians, who are usually very neutral in their political stance, to make this film. We would have expected an Arab to have made this film. And as a result of that, film got selected as the opening film at the Cairo Film Festival, post-release, which is very rare. Usually the opening film of a festival is, you know, pre-release. I went to Cairo, and it was an unprecedented sort of response over there. It got written about extensively all over the Middle East. And the other very unique thing, which is something I'm very glad the Arab population sort of noticed and recognized, is when I was writing the film, I told my producer, I said, you know, this film has a backdrop of jihad and political Islam, but I am not going to mention the word Allah or show even one shot of namaz in this entire film, because I do feel that it has nothing to do with religion. In my experience, from Kashmir to Afghanistan to Bosnia to any of these conflict zones, it really has nothing to do with religion. Most of the time it's a personal thing that starts these people into to go down this territory. And then a month or two later after that, I got a call from the American embassy, American consulate in Bombay, and said there's a lady who's the Under Secretary of State who reports directly to the President Obama and Secretary Clinton, Hillary Clinton, and she's in India, and her mandate is to not meet people from the government, to meet only what they call opinion makers. So, you know, filmmakers, writers, artists, journalists. And she came and met me at Yash Raj, and she knew the whole history of how my visa had been rejected, and so I had a very interesting conversation. She wanted to know how people perceive America in India, and then of course then she gave me that card that if ever you have a problem, you call me directly. So I don't think I'm going to get any visa rejections now.
Hey Kabir, thanks for talking to us today. Much appreciate that. My question would be, in terms of your career, you've transitioned from documentaries to making big budget feature films. What has your experience been from moving on from, say, smaller budgets, shooting with non-actors, to moving with bigger budgets, shooting with actors, in terms of directing, in terms of budgets, and also dealing with iconic stars like Salman Khan?
The process is extremely different. The process of making a documentary versus a big budget Hindi film is, you know, in documentaries you're essentially 2 or 3 people who go into a place with your camera, try and be as invisible as you can, not affect anything that's happening around you. You let stories and moments unfold in front of you. You can't really control them, and then you put it all together. Once you've got your entire material together, you try and edit them and try and put them together as a story. Versus a film where you actually go in with the invading army and you want to control everything. If you can, you would try and control the sun also. And so that process is very different. They both come with their own sort of thrill and excitement of their own, but there's nothing really that I could draw from my documentary experience that I could extend into making features, except for the way I sort of set up a scene. What happens with me is I'm very instinctive in if I enter a location, like if I'm coming into this room, it doesn't take me time to figure out, okay, I want my camera here, here and here. I think that comes from the documentary training. I'm not into doing extended sort of studying of how the light should be. I react more to the situation. In my scenes, I always react to the look. I hate shooting in sets. I've hardly ever shot in sets. Again, I think that comes from my documentary experience. I always want to shoot real locations, even though an art director will say, I will make this room exactly the way it is. I don't want to do it. I want to shoot it here, even if it has restrictions of having a low ceiling and not being able to put my lights there. I still want to shoot in a real location, and I always change elements in my scene according to the location and space that I'm shooting in. Because I think once you're there, the light, the people, the backdrop, that all contributes to the mood of the scene, and I always try and adapt to that, as compared to some directors who try and who feel it's better to stick to the script and push it the way they'd already envisioned. So I think everybody has a different approach. So in that sense, I'm more instinctive, I guess, again because of my documentary background.
Great. In terms of in documentaries, did you have any women in your crew, especially if you were going into places like Afghanistan?
Not Afghanistan. At that time it would have been a problem, because it still restricted the movement of women, and a woman sort of in a car or driving to certain places would attract a lot of attention. So no, it was just in Afghanistan. It was actually always just two of us. But in other documentaries that I've done, whether it's in India or saying, yeah, we have had women who have been part of the crew. There are some women in India who are cinematographers and doing a lot of documentaries. So yeah, it has, but it's always been, in some projects they're there, in some projects they're not there. But in Afghanistan, I've never had a woman in the crew. Actually, I've never had a crew in Afghanistan. It's just been me and my friend. And I shoot myself. I'm a cinematographer, so all my documentaries I shoot myself. It's only my features that I don't shoot, because that would be, I think, taking on too much. I like to concentrate on the actors. But documentaries I shoot myself. So it's me, my camera, and one friend of mine who does sound and research.
The Kabul Express, the American lady, is that true?
Yeah, she is an American actress, and she was brave enough. Sorry?
Real life?
Loosely, as I said, yes, there were journalists at that time in Afghanistan. I mean, women journalists, and she's actually a combination of 2-3 journalists that we had encountered. So it took elements from them and put it into one character.
Great, thank
you. G'day, thanks for today, it's a great talk. My question is probably about your next project. What's happening going next? Heard a rumour there was something called Crazy City. Don't know whether that's coming out this year. And is that inspired, or your next project, is it inspired by a documentary, as a lot of your previous ones have been?
Sorry, I didn't, can you repeat it? If we just
Yeah, sorry about that. What's your next project? And is it inspired by one of your previous documentaries, as a lot of your others have been?
My next big one that I'm working on, as I said, is my dream project based on Forgotten Army. That's a script that I've completed, and I'm really looking forward to making that film. But at the same time, I've been working on another script which is not really based on any of my documentaries. There are elements that I'm drawing from my experiences, but it's actually based on a book that's being written by a journalist called Hossein Zaidi. So this is the first time actually I'm taking the source material from somebody and then trying to, bring in my experiences. That film I might be doing by the end of this year. And The Forgotten Army is something that I'm lining up for next year. But Forgotten Army is the film that I'm really, really excited to make, because I think it's just a story waiting to be told.
Kabir, what are your thoughts on the changing of the guard, so-called changing of the guard, in terms of filmmaking, where any young filmmaker or somebody with interest in film can take a digital SLR, edit the project on their MacBook, upload it onto YouTube or Vimeo, in terms of filmmaking, and also the advent of TV, where a lot of big names are now moving onto TV and creating some really good projects on TV?
I think the fact that because of digital technology, anybody can get access to filmmaking technology is a great movement, because earlier that was one of the biggest barriers. If you have a story to tell, how do you get a film camera, how do you get celluloid, how do you make the film? There's a cost to it. It was very difficult to get the technology. But today you can make a film on your phone, literally, and put it onto YouTube. Of course, the problem with YouTube is there's a lot of rubbish also that comes onto it, and you have to really sift through and see what is good and what is bad. But the point is that that's no longer a barrier. And today, if you have an idea, you can make that film, you can post it on YouTube, you can give it to people, and that can become your calling card to bigger things or other projects. So I think that's definitely a welcome change. It's happening a lot in India. In India, there's a lot of excitement about new filmmakers. I always, because a lot of youngsters from my film school, they come and meet me and they talk to me, and I always tell them, be very careful about your first film, and let it always, this is something I always tell first-time filmmakers, the first film should be totally close to your personality. I mean, if somebody who knows you sees the film, they should say this film can only be done by him or her. Because your first film is something that you will always have to live with. Your second film might be forgotten, your third might be forgotten, but your first film will never be forgotten, and that becomes your calling card. So I always tell them that, don't be in a hurry to put together a project that's coming your way. Do it what you really feel close about. And as I said, because there's an excitement about first-time filmmakers, that there is some passion that they'll bring to it, there is some excitement that they'll bring to it, which is not about second-time filmmakers, because they've already sort of been exposed. So if your first film goes wrong, it actually becomes even more difficult to set up your second film. Much more difficult than setting up your first film, because that excitement about a first-timer has gone away. Then you're just struggling and saying, this is a great script and I've got a great project, and this time I'll prove myself. First film is very important, and even if it doesn't do commercially very well, it should make a mark. There should be people who take notice of it and say, hey, there's a new voice in town.
Well, what did you study at the film school? Was it directing, right?
At Jamia Film School, yeah, it's a sort of a holistic thing where you don't specialize in any one department, but you get your hands on editing, cinematography,
writing as well.
Writing, yes, all aspects. But as I said, it was in those days, it was more oriented towards documentaries.
Okay. So how did you manage that transition from in terms of writing, screenwriting? So
I think screenwriting is, I've often said that screenwriting is such a personal approach, and it's such a personal space that, yes, there are rules to screenwriting, which sometimes do help you, but at the same time, I don't think, I read this book, I forget the name of the author, he's a French journalist who interviewed 20 of the top filmmakers of the world, and the film is called Masterclasses. And the most liberating aspect of reading that book was that suddenly you realize that there are no rules. Everybody has their own approach. Everybody goes about doing it the way they want to do it. Somebody says, I sit with my actors and rehearse with them for 20 days, 30 days before scene. Somebody says, I don't want to see their face before the first shot. I'll just do what I have to do on the thing. Somebody says, I will come into a location with my viewfinder and I, down to the last detail, I block out my shots. Somebody says, I don't want to even look at the camera till I'm in the room, and then I start putting. So you realize, okay, yeah, so it's ultimately what is your gut instinct, how you want to approach. And the same thing goes for screenwriting. I think it's the way you approach it. Yes, there are certain rules, like you reach you study books by the great screenwriters, and but what happens is that if you're screenwriting and if you're writing a couple of projects, you start reaching those conclusions yourself without realizing it's a rule. So if you read it and you try and apply it, it always becomes easier. It's like the classic rule that enter a scene as late as possible, exit as soon as possible. So basically what he's trying to say is, cut the crap, just come to the point as soon as you can, and once you got the point across, don't linger on in that scene. Now this is something that you would anyway do if you're writing a scene, and when you're doing second draft you realize this is all fluff, this is all excess baggage. But if you read and you figure out this rule, you would probably try and apply it when you're writing it.
Hi, my question would relate particularly to the balance between an artistic value in a film versus the commercial viability or feasibility, how you can sell it. So now that you're a successful commercial film director, have you, during the process of making maybe Ekta Tiger, were there instances where you had to make decisions where you probably might have compromised artistic value for the sake of commercial viability?
I think it's a very good question, especially in the context of Indian cinema, because I don't think there's a more diverse audience in the world than the Indian mainstream audience. And you're talking about economic divide, literacy divide, religion divide, language divide. People speak 22 different languages, hundreds of dialects. People earn like less than $1 a day to some of the richest billionaires in the world who want you to send prints to their house to be watched 2 days before the release. So it's a huge diverse audience, and when you make a film like Ekta Tiger, yes, you are a little aware of that, because you know that somebody's putting their money in. Ekta Tiger was the most expensive film that Yash Raj had ever made. It also went on to become the most profitable film for them, but it was a very expensive film. So when I'm making a film, what I would call a pan-Indian film, which means I have to cater to the whole of India in order to cost, you do become a little aware of I won't say, and compromise it has a negative connotation to it. I would stick to adjustments. That's probably more positive. But you do definitely need to make it. As I said, here's Salman Khan, Jim Carrey meets what did I say? Jackie Chan. And but I'm putting him into playing a character. Now Salman usually doesn't play a character, he plays Salman Khan, and people love Salman Khan. In fact, sometimes when he used to get worried about the film and said, why am I doing this? Are you sure about this? I would say, Salman, why are you bothered? If you go to sleep on a bench for 90 minutes and I film it and I release it, I promise you it's going to make serious money before people say, hey, wait a minute, he didn't wake up in the film. So I said, please don't be bothered about it. Just try and play this character, and I'm sure it'll work out. So there are pressures from stars, because they need to protect their image, and they're very, very insecure. I think the more successful they get, the more insecure they get. Sometimes I do understand, sometimes I don't understand that. I feel when you're very successful is when you can push boundaries, but unfortunately in the case of Indian cinema, our biggest stars have always become very safe once they've reached the pinnacles of success, except for the exception of one star called Amir Khan, who has pushed boundaries when he's successful. Then there are pressures from a producer. My producer, I must say, has been very supportive of my ideas, because my brand of filmmaking is very different from the Yash Raj brand of filmmaking, but yet he's backed me always, whether it's a small budget Kabul Express to a medium budget New York to this giant film called Ekta Tiger with So yes, I mean, for example, songs. Now, songs is something I've always, I really enjoy songs as an audience. I think songs is an integral part of Bollywood and should be celebrated. But I strongly feel that they should not be pushed into every situation in every film. Sometimes songs can take away from a film. So in New York, I brought in songs, but I brought them in as lip-sync, non-lip-sync background songs, the way they used in Hollywood films. In Ek Tha Tiger, I was aware that I would definitely need to bring in lip-sync songs, because you really can't have a Salman Khan film without lip-sync. But I could never get myself to having more than 2 lip-sync songs in the film. I just couldn't, because I was seeing the situations, the screenplay, and I said, I can't bring in any more. What do I do? My producer never pushed me to bring in more. He said, if 2 is what you can do, then if 2 is what we'll do. And then we brought in a third, what we call, which is becoming a bit of a necessity in Bollywood, is what we call the marketing song, which we throw it into the end credits. So we use it for marketing to make the film popular, and on the music channels and television, and then we put it into the end credits for people to sort of not feel cheated that we came to the film and didn't see the song. So there are adjustments, and you have to, because you have to pull together a giant audience, and this is something I've always, and I've taken a decision. I've chosen to tell my stories in the mainstream space. I can move into the non-mainstream space and do smaller films like Kabul Express, but I've just felt the power of reaching out to millions is through mainstream cinema. I often call it, this is something I used to face even in documentaries, a phenomena called preaching to the converted. You are showing it to an audience which is already on the same page as you in terms of sensibilities and aesthetics, and they're all going to appreciate your film, and you're going to have a nice engagement with them. But what about the millions in India, which is where you want to reach out to? And I would rather take the risk and throw out these ideas into the mainstream space and mount my films as mainstream films.
Okay, Kabir, on behalf of the City of Melbourne and everyone here today, just wanted to say it's been an absolute privilege to hear from a gifted storyteller. We could keep you talking for a very long time, but we're very fortunate we're going to be able to hear from you again and again with your work that comes out, and it's been amazing access to have you here with us, and we thank you, and we hope you come back to our shores. So on behalf of the City of Melbourne and everyone here, I'd like to give you a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much.